Hi and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, and today we're going to talk about a little cadre of writers and a particular publisher and the work that happened at that publisher on British SF in the 1970s. So this video is about what some commentators have called, and this includes people who were involved, the Faber Mafia, the four British SF writers who formed the mainstay and centre of Faber's SF publishing in the 1970s. Now, first of all, obviously you can see here the first four novels by Christopher Priest, and you've seen them before on the channel. We're going to talk through them in the context of the Faber Mafia and what the Faber Mafia is. Well, Faber and Faber, one of the most distinguished literary fiction houses in the UK, has been for many, many decades. Also very big on poetry and plays. One of their original directors was T.S. Eliot, and when you have Britain's greatest modernist poet on your directorial board, well, you know, you're going to do okay. And Faber, for a long time, has eschewed any contact with SF. They seemed to stop doing it in the very early 80s when one of their editors, a chap called Charles Monteith, who by all accounts was a really great guy, left the company, and pretty much then everybody who was doing SF then was dropped. And their first sort of notable SF was the very end of the 1950s with Brian W. Aldiss, when they published Aldiss's first novel, The Brightfound Diaries, which is a mainstream novel. And he said to them, you know, what else do you like? And they said, well, you know, we quite like SF. And he said, well, I can do some SF, you know, I do SF. And Aldiss had quite a long career with Faber, which ended in the early 70s when he made the move to Jonathan Cape, because by then he was bigger, and Cape were a bigger company than Faber and had more of a cachet, even though there was nothing undistinguished about Faber at all. And he moved on to them, and by that point they pretty much just signed Christopher Priest. They also did books by James Blish, Roger Zelazny and Stanislaw Lem, and my main beef with Faber these days is that even though they keep Solaris in print, the only genre science fiction novel that they will own to, they don't seem to be interested in doing a hardcover reissue, which shows an astonishing lack of foresight, because people are desperate for a decent hardcover of Solaris. We're desperate for a new translation, but even a hardcover, the current translation would work really. So just to sort of put this in more context, Faber signed Priest up just at the very end of the 1960s for Indoctrinaire, which is his first novel. There we go, and that's a very uncommon book now. And Indoctrinaire, initially part of it appeared in New Writings in SF, and then Chris wrote a second part which he tried to sneak through E.J. Carnell's editorial radar, and Carnell said, well, this is a sequel to the previous story you sold me, and we don't do that in New Writings in SF. New Writings in SF, of course, was an anthology series which was published every 6 months or so, and there were 30 volumes altogether. So then Priest's agent said, you know, why don't you put the two together, write some extra material, and we'll see if we can sell them. It was rejected by Gollancz and then was sold to Faber. So that was Priest's first novel, Indoctrinaire. And even though I've talked about it on the channel before, it's worth saying again, you know, you really should read it. It's mind-bending stuff. I see what Faber did in the 70s as very much as an extension of the British New Wave. And in his first interview with me on the channel, Chris was very much of the mind that he was a minor figure in the New Wave. He was just starting out. But of course, the New Wave didn't exactly end as such. Its influence and its character and its very nature, experimental, modernist, literary, spread out into SF all across the Anglophone world. And to me, Priest is very much the bridge between the end of the New Wave and what would come after the post-New Wave writers, who I still regard as part of that school in essence. So this was a very important point in British SF publishing with Indoctrinaire. So really what you're seeing on the table before you is the foundation of Priest's career as a science fiction writer, not in terms of his short works, which are many, and we'll cover those in a separate video, but in terms of his first four novels. These are the SF novels, the pure SF novels, which are the foundation of his reputation as a science fiction writer, which he worked on from the late 60s to the mid 1970s, and they're presented here left to right in chronological order of publication. And as you can see, they're quite simple covers. They're in a octavo format, and they're increasingly becoming very, very rare and collectible. I mean, if you go back 20 years ago, Fugue for Dark Island was an easy book to pick up. Now it's quite difficult. And I want to talk a bit about Fugue, because Fugue, it's the sort of book which, quite frankly, wouldn't get published today, because it's, I would say, the most prescient of any recent SF novel I can think of, in terms of accidentally predicting what is actually happening now, according to some people, in the UK and across Europe. The basic plot of Fugue revolves around the idea that there's been a limited nuclear war in Africa, and that literally millions of migrants are moving from Africa to Europe on ships, and they're coming to Europe. So it's a kind of quiet, slow invasion, except it's very large scale. So it's similar to what's happening with people leaving Africa and migrating to Europe, and this whole issues around sovereignty, legality, human rights, all sorts of issues around that, compassion. There's also issues around cultural change, and these things are all kind of addressed in the book, but really it focuses on a character called Alan Whitman, who is a lower middle class lecturer at a technical college, and he's a liberal, but he's a bit wishy-washy. And as the Afrims, African immigrants, arrive in the UK, he doesn't really know where to take a stand. There's a Conservative government in charge in the UK. He doesn't really know which way to go, and we see his sort of wishy-washy liberalism, his wanting to do the right thing but maybe feeling another, at the core of the book. He also has a very strained relationship with his wife, and the book is split into about, I think, 69 different sections. They're all out of order. It's non-linear. One critic has assembled them in order and read them, but of course, as Chris himself said to me, there is a lacunae, there is a gap in the book. There's a deliberate missing piece which is there to make it even more disorienting, because that's the whole idea of the New Wave, is to sort of shake you up and to make you think again and to change your state of consciousness. And of course, if somebody suddenly found themselves in a situation where a civil war erupts in the UK because of something political like this, due to a scientific change, an atomic war in Africa, then it would be very disorienting indeed. And it's also to get you think about the different sides of the argument. Now, Chris was never clear about which side of the argument he came down on. However, he did revise Fugue for the current paperback edition, and knowing Chris as I do, there was nothing sort of unpleasant about Chris at all that way. But he did sort of beg the question, and he said that he basically wrote the book in response to Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech in the late 1960s, when there was concern about immigration to the UK and the upsetting of the old order. And so it remains an incredibly germane book for our times. And of course, when it came out in hardcover, it was reviewed, I think, in either Time Out or New Statesman, and the reviewer said, good, solid anti-racist book. And then when the paperback came out, a different reviewer in the same publication said, this is a racist book. So it's very, very controversial. And I think it's the sort of book that if a lot of people read today, they'd say, gosh, this should be banned, this is terrible. But it's deeply ambiguous throughout. You also have to remember that an author presenting a scenario and characters isn't essentially expressing his own view directly, because we're talking about fiction. I think Fugue is a masterpiece, and if you haven't read it, I think you should. It's also one of the greatest catastrophe novels ever published. It doesn't pull any punches, and it's incredibly germane to any discussion of what's happening in Britain now, where we're seeing a lot of immigration, we're seeing cultural change, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, and it does ask profound questions about colonial past, what the future is, what the present is, what should be the right thing to do, what should be preserved, what should be lost, and so on. So it's a profoundly important book. And as I say, he did say to me in the interview, and we cut one section which will never be shown unless I have permission, which is really that he didn't want to discuss it too much because of the sort of furore that could come up around it in social media with people who like to shout rather than think. So that's Fugue for Darkling Island. It is available in Gollancz, as I say, fantastic book. I've read it many times. I regard both Indoctrinator and Fugue as seminally important British New Wave SF novels. Then we come to his most famous SF novel, Inverted World. These are all signed, by the way. He signed all of these for me. I think I bought from dealers and they might have been pre-signed because I've had them quite a long time. And Inverted World is really famous in France, where it tops the #2 when they do like a best books ever survey. It always comes at #2 after Lord of the Rings. And of course, in French, Inverted World really sort of means like invert as in homosexual. So it possibly caught on because of that. People might think it's a metaphor for that. If you don't know Inverted World, it's a Gollancz masterwork. It's a mind-bending novel. Some people say it's a hard SF novel. Chris said it wasn't. It settles on a mathematical and geometrical conceit. It's also about conceptual breakthrough and the way of looking at things. All his books are about perception and individuality and subjectivity and the question, what is truth? So he's very akin to Philip K. Dick, even though his style is quite different, beside it being quite flat and accessible and easy to read. There's always a kind of distancing and a brittleness, which I really, really like, which for me is the marker of New Wave SF. And you can see the influence of people like Wyndham, Ballard, but he really does have a voice of his own. So Inverted World is there. In America, it's called The Inverted World. That's an incorrect title because there's an earlier version of Inverted World, which was published in New Writings in SF, called The Inverted World. And that's worth reading as well, because there are some differences between that shorter version and the novel. So if you're looking out for The Inverted World, make sure you get the New Writings in SF edition. I can't think which one it is. It's easy to look up on ISFDB. So there's two variants, so do check that out. Then we have The Space Machine, and The Space Machine is my least favourite of his initial tranche of pure SF novels. Not because it's a bad book, it's a great book, it's great fun, but because it is a proto-steampunk novel. The basic idea is that he mashes the time machine and War of the Worlds together. H.G. Wells is a character, so it's recursive SF, so it's SF about SF, which is a very interesting topic, and at one point I'll write about that. And this is pre-postmodernism, so this is a metafictional conceit before postmodernism became a real thing in literature, though it had been stirring for some time. But it is my least favourite. It's a great fun read, but I don't enjoy it as much as the others because it's not so sparse and hard, and I do like his sparse, hard, hallucinatory work. But of course, writers like to do something different. They like to have a change. And you know, the thing with steampunk is that I don't want to talk about it too much because people go on and on and on about steampunk, and there's an awful lot of nonsense talked about it, quite frankly. But this is one of the proto-steampunk books. If you want to talk about them, there are several others you could mention. For me, the Oswald Bastable trilogy by Michael Moorcock. But of course, you don't really get steampunk until K.W. Jeter coins the term in the 1980s, but that's for another video. It was in the mid to late 70s, after the publication of The Space Machine, that the Faber Mafia really began to come together, and Priest was joined by two other writers at Faber, Robert Holdstock and Garry Kilworth. And here we see some of their early works. On the far left there, Robert Holdstock, I Among the Blind, a title I've always absolutely loved, and I think you'd agree that's a startling jacket design. And Robert Holdstock was born in 1948, and he died very young. He was only about 60. It's a great shame. He's a lovely guy. Met him a couple of times, and he, like a lot of writers, started writing short stories. He did a lot of work under pseudonyms. There's sword and sorcery novels and what have you, and then I Among the Blind appeared in 1976, and it was followed by Earthwind a year later. And when I read these, my feeling was very much that there was an influence of Ursula K. Le Guin, because something about Robert, he was clearly very interested in archaeology and the land and the landscape. They were set on alien planets, and the feeling about I Among the Blind and Earthwind was that they were effective but not essentially that fleet in terms of the writing style. And I must say, I like his writing and I like his ideas, but there's an occasional blockiness and crudity of vocabulary which to me needed editing or rewrites, and that comes up even in his later work. There's a kind of hastiness there, and I think most critics agree on this. And you know, he wrote loads of novels under pseudonyms, as I say, round about this time, before and after, about 20 in total, mostly sword and sorcery. But the sort of energy of them is a bit sort of hampered by the way that the expression doesn't come across. But they are really interesting, and I would really recommend them. Garry Kilworth's In Solitary appeared in 1977, and the latter three books here are all 1977 books. And In Solitary I reviewed in some depth in my video about what SF to read in summer, and this is a great alien invasion story, straight ahead SF story set on Earth some few hundred years in the future, after bird-like aliens have conquered Earth and they have reduced the population, and they keep men and women separately, and men are deemed to be dangerous. And the setting is mostly in the South Seas, some of it is in Europe, so there's a great Pacific atmosphere. And Gary's travelled a hell of a lot. He was in the RAF as a signaller, and he's lived all over the world, and he's written over 80 books, and he's 83 now, and he can write anything. He's incredible. In his early days he focused on SF, and In Solitary was a Penguin paperback. And it's one of my favourite straight-ahead 1970s SF novels. It's got real charm and verve and energy. And I would say Garry is, if I wanted to put him between two people, I would say he's sort of between Michael G. Coney and maybe Brian Aldiss. But again, he's got a voice all of his own. There's nobody else quite like Garry. And he's very open-hearted, and he deals with melodrama really well, has great ideas, and he stuffs them in. And you can't really fault him. I think this is a marvellous, marvellous book, and I love it. I've read it several times. Just to return to Holdstock a moment, Earth, Wind is the one which reminded me the most of Le Guin. And this is about a archaeological dig on an alien planet. And if you like that sort of meshing of, how can I say, folk culture, aliens, extra solar exploration, the sort of thing that Le Guin were doing, things like the word for word is forest. You'd really like Holdstock. He's really good. And he specialised in tropical medicine in his academic career, but he was clearly very interested in archaeology and ancient history, and that comes across as early as Earth, and then it becomes a major thing for him later on. His career really takes off. At the end of the table, there's A Dream of Wessex by Christopher Priest, which is a transitional book for Chris. This is one of the early virtual reality books, and it's also very, very English. There's the intimation of Hardy in there. John Fowles praised this a lot. And in the States, it's called The Perfect Lover. And I see this as a transitional book. And he's moving out of pure SF towards something else, with a focus on the question of what is reality and perception, moves closer towards the mainstream novel, but without sacrificing anything. It's still very much the novel of ideas. So this is what was happening at Faber in British SF, 76, 77. Very exciting stuff. We're now coming to the very end of the 1970s and the cusp of the 1980s. And Chris was again moving forward with his short story collection, An Infinite Summer. And this is out of print now and has been for a long time. The stories in it mostly pop up in the Dream Archipelago collection, or they come up in episodes, his recent collection, which is just there on the shelf. And as you see, a very plain cover, and Chris always liked really plain covers. He wanted all his books just to have covers like this, but of course it's not exactly the most commercial thing. But it was around about this point that he started to get more attention from the mainstream critics, and soon after this was picked as one of the best of young British novelists for the British Book Marketing Council, and a Granta issue which focused on him, Martin Amis, Salman Rushdie, Ian McEwan, loads and loads of people who all went on to be bestsellers pretty much, apart from Chris and one or two other writers on the list, which kind of tells you everything really. But this is a great collection. It's got stories in it like Paley Loitering, The Negation, and The Negation really reminds me of Dina Buzzati, and there's a female character in it who's a writer who I always think is a reference to Ursula Le Guin. Really great story. If you like things like Dina Buzzati's Tartar Step, if you like the Le Guin novel Left Hand of Darkness, I would say this is a cracker for you to read. There's only about 5 stories in this. They're mostly quite long, but it's really, really good. Then Garry Kilworth's Night of Kadar, which is a Generation Starship come colonization novel, which I've talked about on the channel before. His second book. I really love that book. I've read it several times. And it's interesting because it's like an Islamic space opera come planet seeding thing. So if you like things like Adrian Tchaikovsky, you'd like it. There's certain affinities, only in the sort of religious background to Unreasoning Mask by Philip Jose Farmer. And, Garry has travelled in these sort of desert places and he evokes them really beautifully. And I love Night of Kadar. I think it's a fantastic book. Then Split Second, which is mostly set in Crete, which is stuffed with ideas, time travel, shared consciousness with Neanderthals. Really, really great cast of characters. You can feel the sun and the warmth. And if you want to sort of go into exotic locales, you can't really go wrong with Garry's early work. And I really like these books. I think they're fantastic. At the end of the table, we have the debut of the final member of the Faber Mafia, Christopher Evans. Christopher Evans was born in 1951, and I think he hails from Tredegar, which is not that far from where I grew up in South Wales. It's more the sort of Caerphilly Valley and things. And the South Wales valleys are called that because basically they are a series of valleys running parallel to each other from Cardiff upwards to the northwest, as it were, and dispersed with mountains. So you could sort of walk down into one valley, up a mountain, down into the next, and so on, in a kind of wave motion. So Christopher grew up, did a couple of sort of valleys over from me, and that's Capella's Golden Eyes, and this is quite a common book still. He worked in the pharmaceutical industry. I think he was a teacher a lot as well. And again, he did lots of pseudonymous work as well. I don't think Garry ever did any. Certainly Chris did a little bit. Robert did loads. Christopher Evans did quite a bit, I think. And he did lots and lots and lots of things, and it's quite hard to find some of his pseudonyms, but Christopher Carpenter, Nathan Elliott, Robert Knight and John Leon, and there's non-genre fiction, Evan Christie, Alwyn Davis. There's a horror novel which was published in Granada in the 80s, and I can't think what it's called and which byline it is, which is really, really uncommon. I'd love to have one. And he also wrote a tie-in for a film called Plasmid, which was maybe never made. I don't think anybody's ever traced the actual film. The tie-in was written, but the film was possibly never made. So there you go. But this was his first book, which is really, really good. And again, I'm going to invoke Michael G. Coney, who I'm going to do a video about on the channel soon. And it's a sort of classic conceptual breakthrough story, and it's set on a colony planet. There are aliens there, and there's the usual sort of interaction. There's brother and sister character, I seem to recall, so it's coming of age as well, and it's really, really good. And you get all sorts of political daring do as well. So if you like these sort of colonization stories with gentle interactions with aliens, which are very subtle, then become something else, you can't really go wrong with this. And Christopher's had a spotty career. He never quite took off commercially in the way he should have, which is a great shame because he's very good. Though in the 1990s he won, I think, a BSFA for one of his, for Mortal Remains, I think it was, which is a really complicated space opera, which is excellent if you like space operas. We recommend it. And one of his books I don't have is another book from that period, which comes from the mid-90s, a period where I wasn't really reading much SF. It's called Aztec Century, kind of alternate history thing. And I'm after a decent copy of that, so I must try and pick that up at some point. But it's very uncommon in hardcover, and it's the hardcover I'm after. But because he's Welsh, of course, he's of enormous interest to me. And there are very few Welsh SF writers from that period. Just before him, there's David Redd and Peter Tate. And at some point, I'm going to do a video about all of them. Once I've read more of their work, I need to read some more David Redd. And I've got some Peter Tate I haven't read. But Welsh SF, it's a small thing. It's a small country. So I'm particularly interested in what those guys came up with. Now, here's a photograph of the Faber Mafia with some related individuals, and left to right, on the left there with a beard, that's Robert Holdstock, and next to him is Sarah, his partner, who's a really lovely woman. I met her back in 2006. Absolutely charming. What a great lady. Then we have, no, I'm not certain, I'm inclined to think that's Rachel Pollock, but I'm not certain. Then at the front there we have Malcolm Edwards, I believe, who was editor then at, let's think, who was Malcolm with then? I think he was here at Gollancz, and I'm not certain who he was with at that point, but he was at Gollancz later on, and Granada, HarperCollins before that. Then there's Chris, laughing away like mad, and next to Chris is Lisa Tuttle with the glasses on there, and Lisa was Chris's wife then. She, of course, previously had co-written a novel with George R. R. Martin, who was her boyfriend at the time. That was Windhaven. That was back in the mid-70s. And then we have in the front, we have Christopher Evans, and looking over then to the side, there's Garry Kilworth in the plaid shirt. So that's the Faber Mafia and their friends and partners out on the town in what looks like London to me. A little bit of history. We're almost at the end of the period of the Faber Mafia in 1981, where you see these books all come from that year, and it had really crystallized here. And as you see, there's one book by each member of the Faber Mafia, and we have The Affirmation by Christopher Priest, which is, for me, one of his finest novels. The 1980s, I believe, is Chris's finest period, where he has loosened the shackles of genre SF, and he's doing something quite different. He's taking science fiction into a new area, and he's following in the wake of Ballard that way. He's taking a new area, and they're similar but they're different. Ballard took it into Ballardian areas and Priest took it into Priestian areas. And the basic idea behind this is the story of a young man who's had a kind of breakdown, and he gets away to the country where he promises to decorate the home of some family friends, but he actually starts writing his autobiography. but then to try and express a more real inner truth, it becomes a kind of fictionalized autobiography, and then it merges with the story about a young man in the Dream Archipelago who has won a prize which will render him immortal. And there's more to it than that, but that's the way the thing starts off. So there's a solid SF element, but there's also a thing about perception, and it has one of the most amazing endings of any book I've ever read, which I personally love. Some people would hate it, but I think it's a goat and sheep thing. But very, very important. As you see, very plain cover as well. There you go. So this is 81, and probably Holdstock's best early novel before his breakthrough, Mythago Wood, in 1984. And Where Time Winds Blow is again another sort of planetary romance type thing. It's about investigation into shifting time zones, and it's probably the best of his early works. But all these early novels, they do remind me of Le Gan, but they also have a kind of characteristic British spikiness, which I love. And you could see that he'd been working through various things he wanted to express before he could get what he really needed to go. He was very much a writer who grew up in public, and good for him, because when he broke through with Mythago Wood, he really sort of broke the mould and set the scene for a new kind of dark folk horror that focuses on the matter of Britain and the landscape, and with this kind of deepness and darkness that nobody except Keith Roberts had done before him. Gemini God by Garry Kilworth, Garry's fourth novel. Probably my least favourite of the first four. You could see that Garry was possibly growing a little bit unsettled and unhappy with where things were going or not for his SF. And this book in many ways reminds me of Ian Watson's book, it's not Miracle Visitors, Alien Embassy, which is a book which I find exasperating and enjoyable by turns. And there is a kind of real grappling with ideas here, and a willingness to sort of do all sorts of different things and put them together. Telepathic twins, space voyages, and in some ways it's the most traditional of his books. But you know, he was very challenging, but at the same time a very quick, sharp read, because these are short novels. And I didn't like it the first time I read it. I went back to it recently and I enjoyed it. And Garry's early works, they show an enormous promise, which to me only really came through fully in his mainstream novels later in the 80s. If you want to hear me talk about some of his mainstream work, they are covered in the top 10 or top 15, I think it is, associational SF novels. And his book Witchwater Country, I think, is one of the finest mainstream novels I've ever read. I think it's a fantastic book. I absolutely love it. So that's that. And then Christopher Evans, my favourite book by Christopher, The Insider. Very plain livery here. Again, quite an easy book to find, or has been till late. This is really good. This is about an alien organism which attaches itself to somebody in a near future dystopian UK. And it's rather like the symbiont character, or symbiont I think it would be, which is in Brian Stableford's Hooded Swan series with Granger, the star pilot. And it attaches itself to his consciousness, and you never really know which voice is authentic, which is the voice of the human being or the voice of the alien, as they merge together. And as a result of this, the human being becomes alienated from the society. But is it actually through the society itself, or the melding with the alien? And we're told it's the latter, but there's implications of the former as well. So it's quite subtle and quite literary, and I really liked it. And all the way through I was thinking, well, you know, is this really an SF novel? Is this just metaphor? And of course, metaphor's really important for these writers, and all great SF writers operate on the level of metaphor. They're not essentially writing about the surface they present you. If they're writing about aliens taking over your mind, they're not essentially writing about that actual thing. They're writing about that on a metaphoric level, and alienation, as I say. So I really recommend that one. So this was really pretty much the end for the Faber Mafia. There's two more books to show you. I think possibly the very last pure SF book from Faber, or certainly one of the very last ones, is Robert Holdstock's In the Valley of the Statues, which is a collection of his short work under his own name. This is notable because it contains the original short story version of Mythago Wood. Mythago Wood these days is a Gollancz fantasy masterwork, and it's an absolute must read. Some people say it's an SF novel that's couched in fantasy. I think it's a fantasy novel. Either way, you've got to read it. It's absolutely marvellous, and this is well worth getting. And you see Robert working through his early concerns before he really flowers in the 80s and he becomes full blown, and he takes the territory of people like Henry Treece Alan Garner, folk horror, and he makes it his own, and he adds the particular kind of science fiction spikiness that only a true science fiction writer can do. And it's great stuff. And at this point, Faber changed their livery and they'd adopted this familiar colophon there, which is very emotional for me, because that was what they used right the way through my early days in book selling, and that really takes me back. Next to that, this is backtracking a book. This is Anticipations, edited by Christopher Priest, and this was published in 78. And Chris did 2 anthologies. The other one was called Stars of Albion, was co-edited with Robert. They were good mates, and Chris and Garry are very friendly as well, and also Christopher Evans. They, say they were the Faber Mafia. They used to drink together, spend time together. They were good friends, help each other out. And Chris was kind of the elder statesman, but they're all really good writers, so you really should look at all their work. And these were stories which were then new, which Chris put together, and I bought this at the Worldcon in 1987, just before I met him for the first time. And I think this is possibly the first hardcover book I ever got him to sign for me the first day we met, so that's great. And there's some marvellous stuff in here. Ian Watson, A Very Slow Time Machine, fantastic story. Robert Sheckley, Bob Shaw, Harry Harrison, Thomas M. Dish, J.G. Ballard and Brian W. Aldiss. I think that really shows Chris's taste and the people he really revered. The wild card here is Harry Harrison, because he was a great guy and obviously they knew each other, and Chris was fast friends with all these people. And that's a really good look at where British SF was in 1978. Now, Harry Harrison, of course, was American, but he lived in Ireland by that point. He was always gadding about with Brian W. Aldiss, and Tom Dish, of course, had lived in the UK a lot, and at one point Tom and Chris were going to write a book together. Sheckley spent some time in the UK as well, and he lived for a very long time in the Mediterranean, in Spain. I think he lived on Ibiza or Mallorca. And so they were sort of people who didn't feel that comfortable in America, but they did in Europe. So there's some great stuff in there, so that's worth picking up. And it was done, I believe, paperback from Faber. I don't think I've got the paperback. I have owned it at some point, but I don't think I've got it at the moment. It's a pan lozenge. So that's the Faber Mafia. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you dig into these authors. There'll be more about their later work coming up, and I might reread some and read some reviews. I haven't read any Christopher Evans for a long time. I've got a newer one. There's some later Holdstocks I've acquired I've not read, so they'll come up as well. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed that. Dig into these things. Check them out. They're very interesting. Bye for now.